So my story of 9/11 doesn't really involve 9/11, the actual day of. My story begins long before that and ends long after. So, beginning, I'll start at the end. My sister and my brother-in-law were in Normandy, France, going to the beaches of Normandy on Thanksgiving one year, and they were in a little hostel together, and there was nobody else there on that weekend because of course it's crappy and rainy and windy and all that stuff in Normandy, France in November. And they ran into another two people in the inn that were English speakers. And so they went over and introduced themselves, thinking maybe they were going on the tour too. And the gentleman said, "Oh, yeah, this is my dad. He, stormed the beaches of Normandy all those years ago, and he's never been back. And so I wanted to bring him." So they got to talking about things, and he said, "Yeah, I'm the ambassador, and I live in Paris, France, but my dad is an American, and he flew overseas for the weekend." And they got to thinking about it. God, the ambassador of Paris, that must be a great job to get. How do you end up with that kind of a gig? And he said, "Well, you have to serve in Iraq first, or one of the other hot spots in the world, in order to have that type of an assignment later on. Then you get your pick of the plum assignments." And so they began this discussion, and so they found out that they had something in common, that my brother-in-law was over in Iraq. This was the ambassador in Iraq. And as it turns out, they had this common understanding, or this common history together. So I'll stop with that part of the story here and go back in time to when I first went to New York City. I lived in New York twice when I was a young woman, like 1985, maybe the first time, long before 9/11. And I worked on Wall Street, or I worked down at what they called the World Financial Center. So for those of you who don't know anything about New York City, there's the Twin Towers, which are, of course, the great big buildings that went down. But right behind the Twin Towers, between those buildings and the Hudson River, there's the World Financial Center. And I worked for Merrill Lynch, and Merrill Lynch was headquartered in, I think, building number 2. So American Express was in one building, Merrill Lynch was headquartered in the second, Oppenheimer was in the third, and of course you all know about the very famous building number 7, which of course went down after the two towers went down, which interestingly enough is where the CIA was headquartered. So I lived in Midtown Manhattan, and I used to take the subway down to the World Financial Center, which put me right down at the World Trade Center. And you walk across the street, walk through the Winter Haven Park, and that's where I went to work. So I lived in Midtown, but I worked in Battery area. And between Midtown and the Battery is Greenwich Village, Soho, and then down to Battery. So I lived there and lived as a New Yorker, and it was a really fun experience when I was young. And I lived there twice, once about 1985, and maybe the second time about 1989 or so. And it's a completely different life than what you live at, like in Washington State, or, anyhow. So I learned how to live there. I knew all those people. I lived their life. And so it was really poignant for me on 9/11 when I woke up at 5:30 in the morning and turned on the television, and the news came on and the airplane flew into the first building, because I lived there. I worked there. I worked in that area. I know those people. I know the people where you drop your laundry off at the Chinese laundromat, and where you go to the deli for lunch, and of course the Merrill Lynch headquarters building number 1 was completely ruined. I mean, the trading floor was in the building, and the heat from the explosion and all of the wreckage ruined the computer system, and the whole trading floor was completely dismantled. So in one day, even though the building still stood, they couldn't ever use it again. And so they had to take the 1,200 people that worked on the trading floor and move them overnight to the backup trading floor over in New Jersey. So they had 400 people living here, working here, and 1,200 people working here. And so those 1,200 people overnight had to go work someplace else. And that's how it was in New York City. And if you were not a person, if you've never been there, except for maybe as a visitor, you don't realize just the amazing impact that had on people's lives. So then, of course, we went to war after, the buildings went down. And we went into Afghanistan first and then into Iraq. And so that's sort of where my story picks up again. So my brother-in-law, Dave Shepard, he was a Green Beret Special Forces, and he went to Desert Storm first, was still serving, and then, of course, he was called in to go into Afghanistan. So he went to Afghanistan on 2 tours, and then when he'd come home, he would go build houses, for Habitat for Humanity, just do something completely different for his life. And then he was called back again, and so he went into Iraq. And he did his 3rd tour in Iraq in the Green Zone, and his job was to escort the ambassador. His team was the team that guarded and escorted the ambassador, and he was killed in the Green Zone escorting the ambassador from his residence to the airport one day. And my family got the, novel experience of having it was a recorded event, right? So they showed it on the national news, on CNN, over and over again for like a 24-hour period, because it was a convoy of 3 vehicles, and they were all together, and the IED car drove into them. The convoy blew up. My brother-in-law was killed. And the ambassador was in the first vehicle and not in the middle or the 3rd vehicle. And so they whisked him off to the airport. And so that was that. And so it was such an interesting experience for my sister and her husband to run into him in Normandy, France in 2005 or 6, something like that. Very close to, the war was still going on, of course it still is, but the war was still going on. And so they ran into him in that little hotel in Normandy, France, and he was the ambassador that my brother-in-law Dave was escorting to the airport that day. And so the experience of 9/11 impacted me personally and for the country, right? So for the country, for the business that I was in, it was a huge financial setback for people that lived and worked down at the World Financial Center. And then, of course, with my family, we lost people in the war as a result of the bombings down at the World Trade Center. And so 9/11 is such a emotional topic for me. And whenever I go into September, I always have that grave sadness about watching all those people in the buildings. People jumped, people fell. I mean, just that whole experience of listening to their stories, watching the footage, and I remember just being mesmerized by just the incredible destruction down there. And then all those years later, having Dave die, and then having the circle go into its complete form when somebody in my family ran into the ambassador, whose life was saved as the result of my brother-in-law's willingness to serve. And so that's my story for 9/11.